Hello, and welcome to the Zicklin Talks Business Seminar. I am Paquita Davis-Friday, Interim Dean of the Zicklin School of Business, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Inside the NBA Bubble, How Black Players Perform Better Without Fans. Joining me is Gwen Webb, Associate Dean for Executive Programs, who will moderate the question and answer period. Our guests today are Babak, a faculty member in the Zicklin School's Wasserman Department of Economics and Finance, and Paolo Falco, a visiting assistant professor at Stanford University and assistant professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen. Leading the conversation is Larry Zicklin, retired chairman of Norberger Berman, an alumnus and our benefactor, and an instructor in our programs. Larry, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Paquita, and welcome to Zicklin Talks. Just for our audience, 3 academics, 2 of whom you see before you, have authored an academic paper having to do with the performance of NBA players, National Basketball Association players, in the playoffs in 2 successive years. The one in 2019 had fans in attendance, and the bubble playoff in 2020 was without fans due to the COVID epidemic. And their paper discovered some things. So with that as background, let's begin. Let me just ask first, on a personal note, how do the 3 of you know each other?
Well, thank you for having us, by the way. Thank you for that introduction, Paquita and Larry. Paolo, Mara, and I met in Oxford when we were graduate students. I was a relatively older than the 2 of them. I had had a career in finance before I went back to school, but we met at Oxford, and we became close very quickly.
Okay, and what got the 3 of you interested in this particular topic of racism in the NBA by fans?
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having us. It's great to be here. I and Mauro Caselli, the 3rd co-author, was not here, and I had worked on the topic in the context of a different sport, soccer, where we had looked at a similar situation, the absence of fans in soccer stadiums, and we had found a very similar pattern. We then spoke with Babak, our good friend, and he being an expert and a big fan of the NBA, he brought up that the NBA would be a great setting to look at the similar, at the same issue. And so we did.
And why was it a perfect opportunity to do this study? What did COVID and the bubble have to do with this study?
Well, what's unique about the situation, as so many other things to do with COVID, is that all of a sudden, something that we were used to changed radically. And it changed in an important way. Players who used to face audiences of thousands of people shouting at them, all of a sudden were playing in a vacuum, so to speak. They were playing in complete silence. And in fact, if you ask me, what is the one anecdote I can tell about how this study came about, I would say it's the fact that I was watching at the time a soccer game. And it struck me that a game played in complete silence, where all of a sudden you could hear players talk to the manager, was probably a different game. And that may have had an effect on players and a different effect on different players. And this situation is entirely unique because all of a sudden you have stadiums where games are taking place, but there are no fans. It's what we call a natural experiment.
And why didn't you do the experiment and write the paper about soccer? Why basketball?
Well, one original paper is about soccer. And so we looked into soccer. We looked at the Italian Serie A, the biggest, the most prestigious Italian league. And that's where it all started. So in fact, in the Italian Serie A, we found another very striking effect of a very similar kind. Players of African origin and Black players more broadly are positively affected by the absence of fans. And there is plenty of evidence in the context of soccer, and then we'll get to basketball, and Babak will tell us more about this, that abuse is taking place. you sadly cannot open a newspaper every week or every 2 weeks without reading about a black player being shouted at, being booed, even being thrown bananas. That has happened in the past. It's a huge issue, and we were interested in researching it.
But couldn't I attribute that to anecdotal evidence? After all, you get a stadium with 50,000 people and some jackass throws a banana. That's one person out of 50,000. Does that demonstrate anything?
Well, anecdotal would be what you would do if you didn't run the kind of study we ran. That's why you go to the data, you get information, every single player in the season at the time for soccer. Now we'll talk about basketball, before and after the event, and you compare them. And you see that precisely the players that tend to be abused, and by the way, yes, there are anecdotal episodes of bananas being thrown, but the booing is something that happens probably, I don't know, every other match, every 3 matches, something very frequent. You find that those players are the ones who are impacted the most by the change.
And in your analysis in the Italian soccer league, were the black players booed to a greater degree than the white players?
So what we can say is that the players that are typically, based on the accounts that exist, booed and abused are the ones that improve the most the moment that fans are no longer in stadiums. However, we also looked at players who played in teams that had experienced recorded episodes of abuse previously, before the pandemic. So these were teams that we have data on where abuse did actually happen and was recorded, and those players are the ones whose performance improved the most, which is very consistent with the idea that the performance of those players was brought down by those episodes before the pandemic. Once those episodes were over, without fans, their performance improved the most.
And one thing I would add, I think what Larry, you're suggesting is true in that, although as Paolo said, we have really great, excellent data on player performance, we have spotty data when it comes to actual incidents of racist behavior. Although surprisingly, the data is better in the Italian soccer league in some sense, in that the Italian soccer league actually keeps an official track of these incidents. And so what Paolo was describing was that they are able to then use that official source as a way of trying to identify, racist behavior. But when we were looking at the NBA paper, which we wouldn't get to, this was a big problem because the NBA does not keep track officially of any of this stuff. At least they don't report it. And so we relied on going through and looking up all the articles and other studies of racist behavior in cities. But it is one of the limitations that it is a problem that we're not even keeping track of these incidents.
And have you adjusted your data for the fact that an NBA game takes place before 15 or 20,000 people, but a soccer game in the Italian league takes place before 50,000?
That is actually something that there isn't much one can do about, because it's just the nature of the sport. If anything, though, I would say that there is something peculiar about the NBA that makes it an even better and more compelling case to look at. The fact that fans are much closer to the players. So there may be fewer, but they're literally on top of the players. In many Italian stadiums, there's still a bit of distance, if anything, because many of those stadiums still have, because they're facilities that were conceived for other purposes, they have a track around the pitch.
Field.
And so there is a bit of a distance between the players and the fans. Whereas in NBA sports arenas, which are very vertical as well, they are literally on top of the players.
Babak, could you describe your study, your NBA study, both within and without the bubble?
So For sure. So once I heard of Paolo and Mauro's paper on the Italian Soccer League, we thought that the NBA was a very natural next step. And the NBA bubble was slightly different than what happened in the Italian Soccer League, in that the NBA moved all the players into this sort of isolated space in Walt Disney World, Florida. And so the players not only didn't play in front of fans, they played, away from, for part of the time, away from their families and everything like that. But it was a real nice experiment in that we had data on inside the bubble on player performance. And what we wanted to do was do what's called in statistical methods a difference in difference estimation. So that means that we looked at the change from the playoffs in 2019 to the playoffs in 2020 inside the bubble. And then we looked at this change, and we compared the change for white players to the change for Black players. And basically what we found was that the change in the performance of Black players was significantly more positive in terms of their performance improved relative to the previous year, relative to the change experienced by white players.
And was the change in performance dramatic? Was it 5 or 6%, or was it 15 or 20%?
It was quite dramatic. It was statistically significant in the sense that we can, with high confidence, discard the idea that this was just a random incident. And it was also actually significant in that our estimation is roughly that the impact was somewhere between 15 and 25%.
And what metric did you use to make that determination? Was it pure scoring?
No. So what's great about modern sports and statistical analysis is that there's been a strong movement towards quantification of performance in all sports. Baseball has been ahead of all sports, and they have the best data, but the NBA is not far behind. And there's this stat called game score that was invented by John Hollinger, who was formerly of ESPN. Now he's at The Athletic, I believe. And he's also responsible for another one called player efficiency rating, and I believe also wins above replacement. But there are several different metrics. Our paper focuses on game score, which is this amalgamation of performance of players, everything a player does on the court. It takes assists, rebounds, scoring, everything, and creates one data point for it. But and that was the official one we used in the paper. But we checked our results with other measures, and it didn't impact. What measure we used didn't impact our results.
And so was that dramatic? And did it affect all the Black players, or did it affect the best, the top quartile or some number, to a greater degree than the others?
Well, I can take this one. And what's interesting is that the players that are most affected are, in fact, players that, if you look at past performance, are the better performing ones. They're the ones in the top 50% of the distribution, which I think is particularly interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it kind of provides first prima facie preliminary, so to speak, evidence of the idea that this is not just a story about sheer pressure, about just faltering when the stakes are high. Because if that was the case, wouldn't you think that the best performing players should not be the most affected? Because if anything, being the best player means that you can deal with that kind of pressure. It's interesting also because it fits the idea that fans, if indeed they are pressuring players, should probably be pressuring the most precious assets of the opposing team. So if anything, the players that are mostly going to be targeted by fans, are the better players, because they're the ones where fans would imagine they can do most damage, so to speak. And finally, this is super interesting because it also speaks of the economic repercussions of this type of phenomenon, because the best performing players are the best paid players in the NBA. They're the ones whose underperformance costs the most to the teams, who should probably be alert to the fact that this phenomenon may well be costing them a lot of money.
So let me just speak to that for a second. The best players are targeted to the greatest degree, as you point out. Therefore, why wouldn't I assume that if the best players played in the bubble, they would do much better because they're not targeted to the same degree they were? And I don't mean targeted racially. I mean targeted by fans who are booing and screaming because they're the best players in the game.
Well, what we find is that indeed, when they play in the bubble, these are the players that play best. We tend to see that, if anything, the kind of pressure that these Black players get from fans, our evidence says, tends to have a negative effect. We're not saying that all fans are just there, obviously, to abuse players and to shout negative things at them. I still deeply believe, and I believe this for soccer as well, that the vast majority of fans are well-intentioned. But especially in societies like ours, and this is not just the US, Italy is also a case like this, that are, if anything, I don't know if increasingly divided, but where racial cleavages are very evident, very vivid, and very painful very often. You don't need a majority of fans shouting at you to remind you of what's going on and to remind you that there is someone in society that is pushing you negatively, that is trying to affect you for the color of your skin. And that may well have an impact. And I believe that both these things can coexist. Well-meaning fans, for the most part, and a minority who can inflict damage by using abusive behavior.
One thing sorry, Paquita, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the things that happens during the NBA season is that teams go to great lengths to attain home court advantage, but presumably the bubble takes away that benefit. So maybe if you could help us think through the additional impact of the fact that you also don't have the benefit of your home court during the bubble, and with the removal of the fans as well.
Yeah, I would. That's also a great point, and I think to add to what Paolo was saying in terms of Larry's question, and as well what Paquita asked here, you're right. Both of those things are true. The home court advantage has disappeared. If you're a best player, all the fans are going to be targeting you mostly. But both of those things, there's no reason why we would think it impact Black players and white players differently. So even when we look at, this, the part of our study that Paolo was referring to, this idea that the top players performed even more positively relative, Black top players, is that this is when we restricted our sample to the top 50% of players based on their game score from the previous year and also based on their pay and other ways. So we basically did the same exact study, but only using the top 50% of players. And that, again, still includes white and Black players. And what we found, again, was that the Black players performed better relative to white players. So even though, Larry, you're right in that fans are going to target the top players more, but that's also true for the white players. But
I would not disagree, but argue that point a little bit. 80% of the players in the NBA are Black. My observation, this is not a statistical analysis, my observation is more than 8 out of 10 of the greatest players are Black. I mean, it's hard to name, if you name 20 great players in the NBA, it's hard to name 4 in the top 20 that are white. Maybe you get to 2, maybe if you stretch it a bit to 3. I'm not sure you can get to 4.
Maybe you get to 2. Doncic and Jokic are the 2 top 3 best players in the
That's
NBA.
2. Yeah, that's 2.
But yes,
I'll go down the line.
Absolutely.
I just want to make the case that the Black players who come into the bubble have been the ones that have been most targeted, I would argue, just to be controversial a little bit, by fans in general, because they're so great. Everybody is trying to target them.
So is that reason why we don't look at only the star players? We look at the top performing players. So that's the top 50%. So we're still maintaining a big chunk of this of the data. We're just saying if we focus on players that are better than these, you just look at better pool of players, but still in that top.
Let me just ask the question, Babak. If you look at the top 50%, the better players, if 80% of the players are Black in the league, I would argue, and please disabuse me if I'm wrong, that more than 80% of the top 50 are Black.
So I was just about to disabuse you of this. Basically, you're right that the percentage goes up by a little bit, but not as much as you think. I think the overall, Paolo, you can correct me, but I think overall the number was like 78% when we looked at the overall, and then it went up to like 83% when we looked at the top 50%. So it's
it's a small difference. It's a small difference because we look at such a big group. I am completely with you, Larry, that if we were focusing on the top 10%, 5%, 1%, maybe it's true. They may well all be Black, but 50% is a big chunk of players, and the difference isn't huge. And that's why we're looking at that, and that's why we find that with some confidence we can say that this is what's happening.
I want to go back to Paquita's question for just 1 second, a variation of Paquita's question. The Black players are the greatest stars in the NBA, with the 2 exceptions you mentioned. And they, I would think, play the most minutes. If they play the most minutes, and now they come and they travel like every other player, and now they come to the bubble and they don't travel, aren't they advantaged in the bubble to a greater degree than players who don't play as many minutes? And shouldn't they, by definition, play better? If you assume that playing fewer minutes and not traveling, that not traveling benefits people that play the most number of minutes.
Well, what I can say to this is that we have thought about the issue of the amount of time that people play. We've looked at other metrics of performance, and it doesn't actually make a huge difference. And again, once you look at the league overall, I'm not sure that this effect is what's driving the advantage of Black players over white players, because it just doesn't seem to be in the league as a whole such a huge difference between the 2 chunks of players. But Babak, correct me if I'm missing something here. I'm definitely going to say that the idea that there is also an element of how much players plays a role. Sorry for the play on words there, but it's certain. But as far as our checks go, there isn't much we can say that turns the results around based on this concern.
So, and one thing I would add is that we can't directly control for minutes played because game score is a variable that is impacted by minutes played. So we intentionally include that because one of the concepts in sports generally is the best ability is availability. And so the ability to play minutes is part of the reason why we could, but then we also use other metrics that aren't dependent on, so the player efficiency rating is more of just a rating. It's not based on how many minutes you played, and our results still sort of hold no matter how many minutes a players. But yes, we can't fully answer your question to remove that possibility. I think that Larry, you're bringing up. The one thing I would say that, as Paolo said, we've done several checks. One example of checks that we did to try to make sure that this is not about other things is we looked at Black and white player performance, relative Black and white player performance in 2019, comparing home versus away games. And so presumably then Black players should play better at home if away games involves travel and they're playing more minutes. and we found no difference between their performance. We compared, and we did all these different checks. We compared 2019 regular season, 2020 pre-bubble regular season between black and white players. We found no difference. And then we looked at the playoffs in 2020 in the bubble, and then looked at the playoffs in 2021 after the bubble was closed. And actually we found the difference again goes back to 0. So this was something very specific within the bubble. And it doesn't seem to be about travel, given the other checks that we did, but we can't sort of remove that 100%.
So you followed up, because I was going to ask you that the 2019, 2020, and I'm no statistical analyst here, but it seems like a rather limited study, 2 years. But you tell me now you followed it up into 2021.
Yes, indeed. What we did was bringing in data from the following year, because if our hypothesis is correct, we should find that once fans are back in, the positive effect that the bubble seemed to have on black players should dissipate. And indeed, that's what we find. Once you bring in the following season, you find that there is no statistical difference between that season and the season prior to the bubbles, always comparing playoffs with playoffs. And let me add one more point, Larry, to your previous question. The reason that we also think that the amount of minutes played doesn't play, again, the play on words, a big role, is that what we're doing here is comparing players to themselves before the bubble, and then we compare that difference with the difference between white players and themselves before the bubble. So we always control for their baseline level before the bubble. This is what's called technically including individual fixed effects in the analysis. If a fixed effect, so a fixed characteristic of a player, is that they always tend to play more minutes, which tends to be the case because if a player is better, they would have played more minutes before and after the bubble, that should not impact our analysis because it's taken care of.
And did the great white players, I'm talking the 2 great white players that Babak mentioned, did they, I can't remember if they were in the playoffs, did they play better in the playoffs relative to how they played during the season?
Well, this is probably where things get a little bit more, so to speak, anecdotal, because talking about a couple of players, it's obviously statistically difficult, and also maybe it relies on knowledge of knowing the NBA. The honest answer is that I don't know because we haven't looked at the data for those players specifically. I don't know if there is a recollection that they played better, but again, it would probably tend to be more on the sort of anecdotal recollection side. Not to say that this is not useful. I mean, anecdotal is where this all started, so to speak, in a sense that that's where you get the first idea. Now I'm going to be curious, and I'm going to look at this. In fact, we got some questions about this, about specific soccer players in the Italian leagues, and we went and checked, and in fact, we found that some prominent black players in the league had played significantly better inside the bubble, as our theory predicted.
How about the difference between the year and the playoffs, in that there's 30 teams in the NBA. They each play 82 games. That's what, 2,460 games. So 2,460 team games, you divide it in half, that's 1,230 games that are played versus relatively few in the playoffs versus 1,230 games. Does that make a statistical difference anywhere? Does that worry you?
That the fact that we restrict on a relatively small sample of games, we are not worried about that, because if anything, we think that doing the opposite would have been more problematic. What do I mean? I mean that the bubble just happened to be playoff time. So the bubble only exists during playoffs. So the most reasonable comparison seems to be comparing those playoffs with playoffs the previous year. If we had compared the bubble with the entire previous season, we would have been comparing, so to speak, apples with oranges, because we would have compared a playoff season with a full playoff and regular season, which we know would have been probably a little bit would not have been ideal, because if there is anything we know is that the regular season and playoff seasons are very different beasts when it comes to players' performance, players' the stakes, the players' pressure. So it just makes sense, we think, to look at to compare like with like, and that's why confining the study to that group of matches seems to be the reasonable thing to do.
I would argue, without knowing this really, that in the playoffs, the players play better defense. Sometimes during the year, the defense fades a little bit and the offense does well. Does that make any difference in the playoffs as to who is affected by the better defense? Because a great player can't be defended.
Well, so
in the course of a game, the great player is going to score.
In some ways, it's irrelevant because to our study, obviously you're right, and I think the Knicks are winning a few games just because they're playing defense and no one else is. But what we're doing is we're comparing the performance in the playoffs in 2020 to the performance in playoffs in 2019, and so the defense would be similar. Like we would expect the motivation is the same to play hard in both of those things. So if the player's performance improved from that playoffs in 2019 to 2020, it's because of some other factor. It's not because the level of defense has gone necessarily. I mean, obviously the level of defense is going to be impacted by the same concepts as the level of offense, but it's the overall performance. It's not because generally players aren't playing harder on, so that was one of the reasons, as Paolo said, that we really want to focus on just the playoffs, because like you're saying, we can't, it's hard to compare playoffs versus regular season, but we're not doing that. So it's not really relevant for us if players change their behavior between those two things.
Yeah, what was running through my mind is a superior defense would impact a secondary player rather than a star.
Absolutely, but again, it's about the change, right, Larry? So that would have been true 2019 too, so it wouldn't have been a difference.
Oh, okay. What about the randomness of the players? I'm sorry.
So very quickly, Larry, I'm just going to add that we also control for position, so for position in the game. So if players, who play in a certain position, have a certain style of play, they are disproportionately affected by a kind of style of play of the team. So more or less defense, for example, we could we should account for that. I know that it's not the full story, and but it adds to this. I think the biggest the most important thing to say was Babak just said that by comparing like with like on in 2 previous years, these effects should, broadly speaking, be accounted for, because the 2 seasons are equal in that respect, and there's no reason that white players and black players should be affected differently by this effect. But on top of that, just to make sure that some of this can be directly addressed, we also include some elements of how the players actually play, what kind of position, what kind of specific metrics of the style of play, so to speak, are affecting them and are part of their game, and we can control for that.
I watch NBA games to some degree, and I'm always amazed by what I think of as the random events that happen. Some great player will score 52 points one game and 16 the next game. And does that random type of offense influence performance in a short series? Could that randomness throw your numbers off in any way?
Well, again, this is a tricky one, because we've only had one bubble. I mean, if any of you wants to throw in another pandemic and another bubble, we'll be happy to
no,
use
thank you.
But I doubt anybody will want to do that. So certainly the element of randomness is there, and that's why one uses all the data available, because that's what we should say. Of course, this is going to be limited to one season. We've only had one bubble, but in that season, we do absolutely everything we can. We take every single piece of data from that playoff season with all players that have enough games before and after to be compared, and we look at them. And so anything, sure, that is elements of randomness will certainly be in there, but hopefully by looking at all the data available, you can average that out, so to speak.
And I would add that when you find this effect in two separate sports leagues that have nothing to do with each other, like Italian Soccer League and then the NBA, then it's less likely to think that it's random. I'd also say that since finding that the effect disappears when you look at 2020 versus 2021 is also, I think, suggests that this is not a random. And then on top of that, I have to say, as someone who's taught statistics, that the methodology that we're using is accounting for that variation that you're describing. So the statistical test that shows statistical significance, the underlying variable in that calculation is the standard deviation of the game score. And so what we're finding is that the change is statistically significant, despite the fact that this is a highly sort of variable data point. So that actually adds, and then the effect being somewhere between 15 and 25% means that it's also even mathematically significant, actually significant.
So the only event that really was out of the norm, was abnormal, was the 2020 playoff. 2019 and 2021 looked much the same.
Exactly. And we looked at the regular season of 2019 versus 2020. So again, the regular season in 2020 before COVID hit versus regular season in 2019, and we found no difference between black and white players. And this is what's called the placebo test, just to make sure that this is not like something to do with the weirdness of the data, that is really about what happened in 2020 in the bubble.
Could any of this had to do with any abnormal performance in the 2020 playoffs? Were the great stars, were the stars there better than the stars in 2019 or 2021? Was there much in the way of abnormal performance? Did somebody score 60 points and get 23 rebounds, or whatever you tell me? Was there anything there that would throw your numbers off?
There were some major performances during the bubble. Like the famous ones were the duel between Jamal Murray and Donovan Mitchell, where they went at it, and that was sort of where the two of them rose up in the perception of NBA teams and fans. But we're looking at the overall average effect, and there are some instances of like sort of famous performances, but we didn't really see anything in terms of outliers when we were looking at the data.
Are the statistics you get in soccer as good as the statistics you get in basketball?
That's a very good question. I would say that basketball is richer in terms of the array of statistics that you get from a single game, at least in terms of the statistics that are available to us, the researchers. I mean, if you go to a professional soccer team, they'll track their players in all sorts of ways, and they have tons of statistics, but these are not publicly available. What's publicly available for the NBA, I would say, is richer. What soccer does better, we found, as Babak mentioned at the beginning, is that it provided us with a record of actual episodes of racism that happened, racial abuse that happened during matches. And so in that sense, we had something in addition there, which we had to find in other ways which we had to proxy in the study for the NBA. So I would say that probably the NBA, in terms of richness of statistics, has more.
And is there enough in soccer? I look at soccer as a low-scoring game. You get a game 2-1. How much can you take out of that versus 123 to 119?
Yes, absolutely. And in part, probably the richness of basketball comes also from the nature of the game, that you've got the score and lots of other metrics that are tracked and immediately available, like rebounds. I mean, you don't have the equivalent in soccer, for example, and therefore you don't track that. But you can use other metrics. So we don't only use points scored. And just like we don't only use points scored in the NBA, in soccer, you can use assists, you can use the amount of running a player did, you can use the yellow and red cards, you can use, and you can use, an aggregate of all this, which gives you a point like we did for game score. And of course, like any data, there are imperfections. But despite that, you find the result. If anything, what's interesting is that despite the imperfections of the results, and imperfections and error in the results tend to, so to speak, bias down in the sense that it makes it less likely that you're going to find anything in a statistical analysis, we find the results. So one would imagine that, with better data, one could nail this down even more precisely. And so, we were quite shocked and interested in the idea that one could find something despite the imperfections in the data, but that's indeed the case.
Are there greater statistical anomalies among secondary players because they score less, play fewer minutes, and therefore perhaps there's greater variability on a day-to-day basis, while the great players are just great?
Again, depending on the sport and the context, this can differ. I would say that probably, I tend to probably say that the variability in the performance of players of this kind, so these kinds of idiosyncrasies, as Babak said before, don't matter too much in the kind of analysis we do, because once again, we have enough data to think that, with statistical confidence, we have washed it away. But if anything, it would be interesting to dig deeper, also maybe for other projects and for a broader academic interest, into what is the element of variability and how it changes between the two sports, for example. But as far as we can see, it doesn't make a huge difference for our results.
I would say, though, that just separate from our paper, my instincts would be that the answer to your question is yes, because part of what makes a player a top performing player is that they're more dependable, and so that means that they will bring their best performance on a day-to-day. Obviously, like sometimes LeBron doesn't have a great day, but generally LeBron, what you're going to get out of LeBron when he's playing, while a player that's not as good is more like one day really good and one day terrible. So I think the answer to the question is probably yes. But if your next question would be, do you think it would impact our results? As Paolo said, I think we are controlling for that in our analysis.
And I guess it would also be interesting to see how this differs between the two sports. That's probably what I don't know. I completely agree with Babak. What makes a good player is the fact that they're dependable. So on average, their scores are going to be higher and probably more stable. But I'd be curious to know what's how the two sports differ in this respect, and where you find more variation among top and less among top players and less good players, so to speak.
I noticed there was some movement to get fan behavior improved as they're closer to the court. I don't know what closer means. Does it mean 1 row, 5 rows, 50 rows? But do you think that would help? Well,
it's interesting. So one of the reasons that I thought that the NBA would be when Paolo and Mauro told me about their paper, I thought the NBA would be a great test case for this, is that the NBA has experienced many incidents over the last several years. And so then I started looking, and I had a general memory of these things, particularly from when Trae Young was spat on in MSG during the 2021 season. And so
remember, he's probably the best player on the Atlanta Hawks.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but by the way, just to give you an analogy of for the Atlanta Hawks, the way when we looked at the best players, it would be like taking their top 7 players or something like that, not just Trae Young, or top 5 best players. But anyway, when I started looking into this, I realized, and I was kind of surprised, that the NBA kind of decided that there were several bad incidents that were reported. Obviously, this thing's been going on forever. In our paper, we talk about how Bill Russell talked about his relationship with Boston Celtics, and players have talked about racist incidents all throughout the history of the NBA. But these last few years, they've been sort of more social responses and cultural the responses to the incidents. And it got to a point where the NBA announced a zero tolerance policy in 2019, which is even before any of our analysis. But then all the incidents that we found in the articles were post this announcement of a zero tolerance, including incidents where Carmelo Anthony was called boy, Russell Westbrook was called boy by fans and yelled at. So in some sense, the NBA's sort of zero tolerance seems to have had, as far as we can tell, no effect, although we don't have any official measure of this. So the NBA doesn't even measure it. So it's like, we can't tell if it's gotten better or worse, but anecdotally, it doesn't seem to get any better. And the other thing I would say is that, as Paolo said earlier, that there is actually a big chunk of this, maybe if this is due to racism. And again, our paper can't definitively say that what we've observed is that Black players play inside the ball better without fans. That we can sort of confidently say is true. What the cause is, we can't 100% say, but we feel like given all the things that we pushed out as possibilities, we tested all these other possibilities, and we keep coming back to racism as an issue. And if racism is the factor, then it's not something that you can easily remove, because even if the NBA got fans to not yell boy at the players, if the NBA can't stop fans from screaming and yelling and being aggressive in their, sort of cheering, and then even then, players are faced with what we call latent effects of racism, and that racism isn't just in the arenas. If racism exists in the society we live in, and these players are part of that society, and so they're living within a society where they're affected by racism, and they go into an arena where predominantly white fans are screaming at them, there might be, it seems reasonable to think that the latent effect of the society they live in might be. And if that's true, then removing it just from the arenas isn't going to be a solution. And this is more of a societal problem than just some rules at an arena.
I guess we would have to investigate whether these are anomalies, 4 fans out of 20,000 who are creating these incidents. I think of them as anomalies, having been to many basketball games, and I've seen some of it. But you see 1 fan in the crowd or 2 fans in the crowd, and I make less of it. Let me ask you this. Are there certain cities that are more hostile to Black players than other cities?
Well, that was one of the interesting things. Again, in all the anecdotal evidence, Boston comes up a ton of times. But one thing I would tell you, Larry, is that my instincts are exactly what you're saying. This might be some rogue fans. This is not a common thing. But then when you listen to the actual players, they don't sort of make it sound like that. The players, the quotes from them in all the articles, Marcus Smart talking about Boston, it says, yes, of course, this is not new to me. LeBron talking about his experiences says, yeah, of course, I've seen it all the time. I try to not let it affect me. So I tend to say, it seems that it's on the minds of the players and something that they think is a real problem. So it's in that sense, then I think to me that suggests that it is. If the players are the ones saying that this is an issue, then in some ways it must be.
Might you consider doing some research into the performance of Black players in hostile cities?
So part of our results, which we are not as confident as the other aspects of our paper, is that we looked at if this result varied by region of where the teams are from. And we found that the effect was more significant for teams in the South and the Northeast. And this suggests, and this matched some of the evidence we've seen, like we looked at Google search data that suggests that more racist Google searches happen in in the Northeast and the South, and that might suggest that that sort of matches the results we're finding. But we're not super confident about that. We would love if we could find data on somehow some metric of the level of racism by city. Yes, that would be the perfect way. And then if we had that data, we could do a very quick analysis and tell you with confidence that this is about racism, and this is the effect as racism increases by this much. This is how much the effect happens. But as we said, there's no data on racism, racist incidents. There's very little data on the level of racism within a city across the country. So the data is just not there for us to go into that level of depth.
Why would it be difficult to determine the performance, the average performance of Black players and their performance in places like Boston?
It's not difficult. What's difficult is to, in a non-biased way, measure the level of racism in a city.
And also, let me add to this. Remember that we also just have one bubble. We always rely on what's called the identification strategy, technical term for the instrument, the experiment that allows us to say what we're saying with confidence, given the kind of analysis we ran on that one instance of the bubble when players were playing without fans. And what we can do is compare the performance in matches that took place against teams that would otherwise come from cities where there is more racism. And sure, we can do that, but we're always going to be limited by only a certain amount of matches that we can compare to what happened outside the bubbles, which are the ones that took place in the bubble. And that's why it statistically becomes very difficult, because once you start splitting this down very finely by cities, you immediately realize that what happens is that you got just one team per city and only so many matches, and then the statistical confidence with which you can say this becomes much weaker. So certainly, this is absolutely fundamental of a research question, but probably we should look at other ways of researching it beyond what we've done here, which was exploiting a natural experiment, which was, perfect for the kind of study we wanted to do, but also obviously limited in the amount of information.
I just have one last question. Internally, among the three of you who did the study, what troubled you the most about your conclusion? Or did anything trouble you?
So I would say that, it comes back to what Babak was saying earlier. We put the study out there and people want us to give with 100% certainty an answer about whether this was because fans were shouting from the stands before. As Babak was saying, and our paper is very clear about this, what we can say with complete confidence is that once fans were no longer there, this is what happened. This is indirect evidence that we corroborate and we pair with a whole bunch of tests, which, as Babak once again said, all go back to the idea that there is a very strong conclusion about this being about racist sentiments. But obviously, what one should do in theory to get this completely nailed down is to switch off the racism itself, not to take fans completely out of the arena. That's an experiment that, however, one cannot do. So of course, we need to be careful in putting this out. We are being super honest and super transparent about the fact that this all goes in that direction, but obviously we cannot nail it down 100%. But on the other hand, putting this under the carpet because we cannot nail it down 100% where there is such a strong evidence will be equally,
not helpful.
Negative, not helpful.
I'm sorry,
and
Gwen.
obviously, would be obviously, something that
You're not going to do it
equally negative as a message. Yeah, exactly.
We do want to switch. There are several questions throughout the webinar. Many of them dealt with technical aspects of your testing, which I think you really answered in the discussion. There have been a number of participants who asked the question I think you just dealt with. What did you actually show? How can you make these inferences? But I do want to get to at least a couple of the questions. One of the first ones that came in was, has there been any reaction to your paper from the leagues, either the NBA or the Italian Soccer League?
So I can say that on the Italian side, we got some interesting reporting. In fact, this went on the New York Times at some point, so it actually became quite internationally known, the study. And journalistic reporting, yes, a lot of interest, but not a ton of reaction from the teams themselves.
Yeah, and I when I suggested this paper to Paolo and Mauro, as a big NBA fan, I was like, wow, it may be that one day LeBron might retweet our paper. But no, sadly, there has been, from the NBA players, there's been no response to one of the journalists. So several journalists were very interested. I have sort of talked about it on a couple of NBA podcasts. But I also sent it to the NBA Players Association current head and former head, other NBA heads and leaders, including Adam Silver, and still no one has responded. No one's even acknowledged it. So no, we haven't had any response from the league.
Can I very quickly say to this that it's a very difficult issue to respond on for all sorts of reasons, and without getting into complicated discussion, I'll just put out one issue out there. It's actually not even in the players' interest, even the Black players who are negatively affected about this, to discuss this too openly, if anything, because they're worried that it may make them seem weak. It may make them seem like they're players, that they are negatively affected by fans who want to hurt them, if one believes our story, and therefore they'd rather not. And this is, if you allow me to say this, the ultimate perversion, and in a sense, very, very, very negative aspect of this, that it's an issue that even if it's there, one doesn't want to talk about, because the moment you talk about it, and by the way, doesn't this ring bells of the Me Too movement and these kinds of things, without again going into complicated discussions about this, but I kind of see things coming together. And once again, I don't want to make claims that we cannot make. The paper is super transparent about this, but as I said before, sweeping this under the rug would be equally detrimental.
All right, thank you. There's a question here for Paquita. And very briefly, Paquita, what lessons do you feel are most important for the owners of these teams from a business perspective?
Well, yes, Paolo just touched on this a bit. We happen to be in a market with some of the most valuable sports franchises in the world. And at a minimum, there should probably be a standard or code of conduct for participation in the arenas that the owners should think seriously about enacting if they haven't already, and about enforcing, of course, because what we probably heard described at a minimum is a hostile work environment. And so translating that to a corporation, it certainly wouldn't be tolerated. So it also should not be tolerated in the sports arenas.
Thank you. Larry, the last question that we have time for, we have a lot of student athletes at Baruch College. What, in your opinion, is the most important implication of Babak's and Paolo's research for them?
I think it's interesting for them to be aware of this research. I think it's interesting for them to keep their eyes open, but I wouldn't want to see them change their behavior. I would like them to perform as best they can wherever they are, and I would like them to feel free to report to the proper authorities when things get beyond the normal fans cheering and booing. I think that would be a great addition.
Thank you very much, Larry. I want to invite our audience to our next webinar, which is on Valentine's Day, February 14th. The topic is corporate proxies, shareholder votes, and making your vote heard. Larry's guest will be Jay Daya from our Economics and Finance Department, and Caitlin McSherry, the Neuberger Berman Director of Investment Stewardship. That's it for today, but I want to thank you, Paolo, Babak, and Larry, and Paquita for a great discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, guys.
Very much.
Thank you,
all.
Paquita.